This video will help you complete pages 6 and 7 of your small engine reconditioning packet. On page 6 of our packet, we'll be measuring the journals of the crankshaft. A journal is a precise machine surface that rides inside the bearing. To make sure that you are measuring the correct spot of the journal, look to see where the bearing fits around the journal. This is important because sometimes the crankshaft ends are tapered and this will give you a false measurement. The items we'll need to complete this page include our crankshaft and the appropriate size micrometer. The first part of the crankshaft that we'll measure is the PTO journal. The PTO end of the crankshaft allows the engine to transmit power to an application. This could include turning a lawnmower blade or turning a pulley that would drive a belt for a snowblower. To measure the PTO journal, I used a 1 to 2 inch micrometer. Here I am measuring the PTO journal of my crankshaft. Just like all of our other round measurements, I will measure this in 2 different directions to check my outer round and to find an average measurement. Here is my D1 for the PTO journal. For my second measurement, I'll measure perpendicular to my first measurement. This will be my D2. Here's what I measure for D2. For all of my measurements on page 6, I'll first find the outer round by subtracting D1 from D2. Then I'll find the average of my measurements by adding D1 and D2 and dividing by 2. Our next step of this page will be to measure the crank pin journal. The crank pin journal is what the connecting rod bearing connects to. For this measurement, I once again used a 1 to 2 inch micrometer. Here is how to measure the crank pin journal. Here is what I measure for D1 of the crank pin journal. To find D2 of the crank pin journal, I'll measure perpendicular from my first measurement with the same micrometer. Here's the D2 for the crank pin journal. As part of the crankshaft that we need to measure is the Magneto journal. The magneto end of your crankshaft is where your flywheel bolted to. Unlike the other 2 measurements, I had to use a 0 to 1 inch micrometer to measure the Magneto journal. Here is how to measure D1. Here is the measurement for D1. For D2, my measurement will be perpendicular from the spot that I measured for D1. This is what the micrometer read for D2. Your last step of page 6, you're going to compare your measurements to the specifications at the top of your page. That you're done with page 6 in your packet, you'll turn to page 7 where you measure the crankshaft bearings. The items you'll need to complete page 7 of your packet include the connecting rod, the front cover, also known as the sump cover or crankcase cover, the engine block, the appropriate size micrometer, telescoping gauge, and small hole gauge. The first step for completing this page is to measure the PTO bearing. This is the bearing that the PTO journal rides in and is located inside the front cover/sump cover. When measuring the bearing, you will need the appropriate size telescoping gauge or small hole gauge and a micrometer. Be careful when you make this measurement to ensure that your measuring tool is not resting in an oil passage. Just like my PTO journal, I used a 1 to 2 inch micrometer. Here is the D1 measurement. To make my D2 measurement, I'll go perpendicular from my first measurement while still avoiding any oil passages. Here is the D2 measurement. The next thing I'll be measuring for this page is my crank pin bearing. To measure the crank pin bearing, we'll do the same thing we did with the wrist pin bearing. We'll choose the right size telescoping gauge or small hole gauge to measure the inside diameter. When making this measurement, be careful of the oil passages and where the connecting rod cap splits. For this engine's crank pin bearing, I had to use a 1 to 2 inch micrometer. Here's my measurement for D1 of the crank pin bearing. We will now measure D2 perpendicular to our D1 measurement while still avoiding oil passages and where the connecting rod cap splits. Here is the crank pin bearing D2 measurement. The last item we will measure for page 7 of our packet is the Magneto bearing. The Magneto bearing is located in the engine block and is what the Magneto Journal rides in. Because the Magneto bearing is an inside diameter measurement, we will once again be using the appropriate size micrometer, telescoping gauge, and small hole gauge. Here's what the 0 to 1 inch micrometer read for D1. You'll make your D2 measurement so you can calculate out around and your average measurement. Here's the Magneto bearing D2. The last section of page 7 is to calculate the bearing clearance of the PTO bearing, crank pin bearing, and the Magneto bearing. From this calculation, we are trying to figure out how much space is in between the journals and the bearings. To find this, we simply take our journal average measurement from page 6 and subtract that measurement from the average bearing measurement on page 7. If your calculations give you a negative number, one or more of your measurements may be wrong, or you completed this equation wrong. For the engines we are working on, the journals are always smaller than the bearing. If the journal was bigger than the bearing, this would be considered an interference fit and would require additional tools to disassemble. Just like on page 6 from the packet, you will compare your measurements to the specifications you found from this engine service manual. This comparison will help you determine if any of these parts need to be replaced or not. You have now successfully completed pages 6 and 7 of the small engine reconditioning packet.